Hello and welcome to Topic 3, Lecture 2. And in this lecture, we're going to be talking about the eras of federalism. All right, so in our last lecture, we looked at the framework of federalism in the United States Constitution. You learned about the express powers, the implied powers, and then the powers that are reserved to the states that comes through the 10th Amendment. So even though the power sharing relationship is set in the Constitution, that power sharing relationship has changed over time and quite significantly. And so what we're going to be learning about in this lecture is we're going to be learning about the different eras of federalism. And they are divided up into 4 eras. And so this basically shows you the 1789 when the Constitution is ratified, that the first era of federalism is known as dual federalism. And it lasts all the way until 1937 when we begin to see changes in the Supreme Court. So the second era of federalism is cooperative federalism. Then in the 50s through the 60s, we have regulated federalism. And the era that we're in today is new federalism, okay? So all of these are federalism. The difference with these different eras is the way in which power is divided within that particular framework of federalism. So let's go ahead and get started and dig into each of these eras a little bit more deeply. So the first era is the era of dual federalism. And as it's sometimes referred to as the traditional system because it's thought to be the way that the framers traditionally thought about this separation of powers between the national government and the state's government. And it's really the type of federalism that has lasted through much of the United States history. I mean, when you look at that time period here from 1789 to 1937, that's nearly 150 years. And so, sometimes the dual federalism also is explained by looking at a layer cake. It's sometimes known as layer cake federalism. And that's because there were distinct layers and distinct roles that the players, the state and the national governments played. And so within this traditional system of dual federalism, the national government was small with narrowly defined powers. And I tried to find a cake that had just 2 layers, but one layer was really big. I couldn't find a picture of that. But here we have, this is the national level, the white layer of the cake. It's small and clearly defined. And that the most of the focus of the national government was on commerce and economic development during this time period. And the states did the vast majority of the governing. You can tell because as the layer cake suggests, look, the purple layer is the states and they're the ones that do most of the governing. And so, property law, criminal law, education, etc. All those reserved powers were really quite large and reserved to the states. Now, keep in mind, that this is, just coming out of confederalism, where most of the power was in the hands of the states. It's no surprise that under dual federalism, that most of the power is still in the hands of the states. Under confederalism, the Articles of Confederation, that white layer would have been much smaller, right? So the white layer has gotten bigger, but most of the power still remains in the hands of the states. Okay, and so here is the graph from your textbook that shows the breakdown of federalism, the breakdown of the distribution of powers within this era of dual federalism. And so, you see here, I'll let you read through this in your textbook, but this is the powers. This is what the national government did, right? I mean, currency, internal improvements, tariffs. But then this is the long list of what the state governments did, and this is what was left to the local governments, right? So you can really see that, power was shared, but power was heavily vested at the state and local level. So the 20th century brings about changes to the traditional federalism system. These changes, as you're going to read about in your textbook, don't happen in a vacuum. But these changes are a response to historical events that are going on at that time, and also the constitutional interpretation of federal powers and how the Supreme Court has interpreted those powers over time. And so I mentioned this at the beginning. The first era we're going to talk about that brings to an end the dual federalism system is cooperative federalism. Then we will talk about regulated federalism, and then we'll talk about the era of federalism that we're in today, which is the era of new federalism. So cooperative federalism is defined as the type of federalism in which grants and aid are given to states to encourage states to pursue nationally defined goals. Well, what in the heck does that mean? Well, basically what cooperative federalism is it moves away from that layer cake model, where it's like, this is the layer of the national powers, this is the layer of the state powers. There's not a lot of intermingling that's going on. The era of cooperation is having the national government and state governments work together cooperatively in order to achieve goals that are defined by the national government. And this really changes that power sharing relationship between the national and state governments. But like I said before, these changes in eras didn't just happen, they happened for a reason. So let's look at the reasons for the onset of cooperative federalism. So what brings about the shift away from dual federalism to cooperative federalism? Well, there are two major factors that bring about cooperative federalism. One is economic, and the other has to do with the Supreme Court. And so the Great Depression of the United States happens in the late 1920s, not just in the United States, but throughout the world. And, you know, the Great Depression is a huge economic downturn where people lost many jobs and the value of currency really plummeted. And basically, the national economy and the world economy was in shambles. We think about the Great Depression as being a long time ago, but in your lifetime, depending on when you were born, you might have experienced two sort of similar situations, not as bad as the Great Depression, but same sort of like economic collapses. The one was in 2008, and that was a response to the collapse of the housing economy in the United States. If you've ever seen the great movie, The Big Short, I recommend it. It stars Steve Carell. It's not a comedy though. Directed by Adam McKay, if you're familiar with him. You know, this is a movie about the housing crisis in the United States and how banks bet on selling these mortgage-backed securities that were worthless. And it brought the economy of the United States and the world economy to its knees. And it wasn't called the Great Depression, but it was called the Great Recession. And just, coming out of COVID, the year or so after COVID, that we, because things are shut down because of a global pandemic, people lose their jobs. There's unemployment. There's a reduction in economic activity, etc. And so we've kind of lived through those things, and so you could sort of think about what that is sort of like in terms of how they responded to the Great Depression in the 1920s and 30s, and how we've responded to it in the 2008s and then today. And how we respond to it is the federal government takes a very forceful role in trying to fix our economy, right? So in 2008, when we have this recession, that there's a lot of spending on shoring up our economy, and same with during the COVID pandemic, people were getting unemployment benefits, we were getting child checks, tax credits, etc., all in an effort to improve our economy. So that's exactly what happened with the Great Depression, that the national government was faced with poverty, unemployment, horrible economic situations, and the federal government had wanted to do something about it. Now, up until this point, we depended on states to do those things, but states couldn't do those things anymore because they were out of money. And so under the leadership of the Democrats and the Franklin Delano Roosevelt's administration, they passed what are called a series of laws that were designed to improve the economy of the United States, and they're known as New Deal legislation. And so these were federal federal programs that were designed to deal with poverty and unemployment. And the way that that was achieved was that the federal government gave states grants that they could use in order to deal with these problems. Very similar to what went on after COVID, right? Where the federal government was giving states money in order to deal with the economic fallout from the COVID pandemic. So that's one thing that happened, right? A great economic crisis, and suddenly the national government and the states had to work together to solve that problem. Another shift, and that's why this starts in 1937, because it shows a shift in the way that the Supreme Court of the United States thought about this provision within the Constitution in Article 1, Section 8 called the Commerce Clause. What the Commerce Clause is it basically gives Congress the power to regulate commerce or economic activity between the states, interstate commerce. But during this time period, and really before this time period, the federal government wanted to go into states and begin regulating working conditions within states, right? Making sure about, that we had shorter working hours, and not instead of having a 15-hour week, having a mandatory 12-hour, or not week, but a 15-hour workday, have a mandatory 12-hour workday, make sure that there were, livable conditions within factories, that people weren't losing limbs, that children weren't being used as workers. But states cried foul. They said the Commerce Clause says that Congress can regulate commerce between the states, not within the states. But in 1937, the Supreme Court changed its way of thinking about that and gave the federal government power to regulate commerce within the states. And so that also kind of brings up this intertangling or this intertwining of the national and the state governments. The cooperation is achieved through grants. And you'll read more about these in your textbook. Grants and aid. And what grants and aid are is that it's federal money that's given to the states, and it's given to the states to use for specific national purposes, okay? Here's a bundle of money, use it to decrease unemployment in your state, create jobs, just for an example, okay? And so it was that cooperation took place, federal money given to states, states had to figure out how to use that federal money to achieve these national goals. One of the largest and most effective New Deal programs is what's known as the Works Progress Administration, or the WPA. They were responsible for, creating massive public works projects that employed millions of Americans, gave millions of Americans jobs when they were struggling during the Great Depression. So constructing highways, bridges, public parks, and public art, as well, as you can see here. And you can see some of these in, buildings throughout Wisconsin and beyond. And so works pays America, and prosperity, WPA, you see there. And so, this is, a good example of the public art that took place at that time period. And so from 1935 till 1943, the federal government spent over $13 billion. That's back in days of yours levels of spending on the WPA. And they were able to really avert the massive poverty and the massive unemployment because of this investment in jobs from the federal level that was played out at the state level. And I'd be remiss if I wasn't showing you two cakes, right? So we talked about the layer cake being the cake that was representing dual federalism, where the national government had one layer and the state had another layer, and that those layers didn't intermingle. And in fact, the state layer is actually bigger than the national layer, right? Cooperative federalism isn't a layer cake where you have distinct layers, but instead it's a marble cake, right? So I don't know if any of you have ever made a marble cake, but when you make a marble cake, you have vanilla batter, which is white, and chocolate batter, which is brown. And then you pour both of those batters into the cake pan, and then you take a toothpick or a chopstick, and then you swirl that batter around, creating a marbling effect. And that is what cooperative federalism is, because there are no distinct layers, right, that the federal and national government and the state governments intermingle in order to create a delicious cake. In this case, it was a cake that was designed to alleviate economic despair. Regulated federalism is the next era that we are going to discuss. What is the textbook definition of regulated federalism? Well, it's a type of federalism in which Congress imposes legislation on states requiring them to meet national standards. Okay? You might be saying, well, wait a second, what's the difference between regulated federalism and cooperative federalism? Well, cooperative was cooperative, right? It was sort of like the national government said, hey, here are big goals we need to achieve. Hey, states, let's work together cooperatively in order to achieve these goals. Regulated federalism is basically dictating to the states, right? It's moving it closer to the unitary model that we talked about, where the national government has all the power and they kind of dictate it to the states, like what the states should do. And so regulated federalism is sometimes known as coercive federalism because the federal government is getting much more top down in terms of saying, this is what we're going to do, and that states, you implement it, right? Exactly how we say. So it's a very heavy-handed use of national power. So what brings about the shift from cooperative federalism to regulated federalism? Well, what brings about the shift is growing concern in Congress and the national government in Washington, D.C. about inequality throughout the nation. And so under cooperative federalism, states are cooperative players and within, the goal of achieving national goals. And so they have the power to implement important policies. And so the federal government has these national goals, and the states are supposed to be cooperative players with achieving those goals. And then they get federal money, and they're supposed to implement those monies in order to achieve these national objectives. But in the 1960s and 70s, the national government started looking at states who were these cooperative players, and they realized that there was really severe inequalities between the states. So states would get money for Medicaid, which was to address Medicaid is the program that gives health insurance to people who are poor. But the states are the ones who implement Medicaid. And so, looked around, and in some states they did a really good job providing health care for people who are of lower income. In other states, they didn't. Same with alleviating poverty, addressing mental health concerns. States were given federal money, but some states did a great job, some didn't. And so there's this growing inequality in terms of economic and other sorts of inequalities that was springing up throughout the United States. And so, when the national government decides that they need to take a heavier hand in dealing with some of these national problems, they're doing it because they want to make sure that we don't have this unequal system. There's also rising concern in Washington, D.C. and Congress about states' treatment of citizens, that they're treating citizens unequally, particularly racial minorities. And so, for example, that when Congress passed the Economic Opportunity Act, people in Congress would say, well, this is one of these cooperative federalism programs where we're giving grants to states. Well, can we really trust some state governors to do the right thing to address economic inequality, even if those state governors are known to be like racial segregationists? And that was the case in Alabama. So in Alabama, George Wallace, a known segregationalist, he was the governor at that time, and there was the sense of, we don't feel comfortable giving money to states, and that they are going to not use these monies in the intended manner. And so there was this sense that the national government needed to be a little bit more like heavy-handed, a little bit more regulating what states actually do with these federal monies in order to achieve a reduction of inequality within the United States. So how is this regulation achieved? Well, it's achieved through an increase in the passage of regulatory laws at the federal level. And so, the federal government, sort of takes a top-down approach on a variety of matters. One, is that in the 1970s, the Occupational Safety and Health Act, OSHA, is passed. And this is, again, a way of saying that we're not going to abide by inequalities within states. All states have to make sure that they're their workplaces are safe and healthy. You also see a concern about inequalities regarding clean air and clean water. So you have the Clean Air Act that's passed in 1971, 1974, the Highway Energy Conservation Act, because there was an energy crisis at that time. And so, it was sort of like, these are crises, we need to deal with them, and we have to make sure that states are actually going to get in line. And so there was a much higher level of regulation coming from Washington, D.C., and being implemented and imposed on the states. There were also preemptions that allow the national government to override state and local actions in certain policy areas. Okay, a really good example of that is the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 basically told states, particularly states in the South, that they could not continue to engage in racially discriminatory policies as it relates to access to the ballot, the right to vote. And so the Voting Rights Act basically nullifies state laws that are seen as racially motivated and making it much tougher for racial minorities to vote. So that's a good example of both preemption, but it's also a good example of the kinds of laws that were passed during the regulated federalism time period. And this brings us to the last era of federalism, and it's the era that we are currently in, and it's known as New Federalism. What New Federalism is a type of federalism that attempts to return power to the states through the use of a thing called block grants, okay, which you'll read about more in your textbook and we'll talk about in a second. And so, you kind of see this sort of, as we're looking at these different eras, we have the traditional era where we have, powers that are separated, between the national government and the states. Then you see an intermingling of them through cooperative federalism. Then you see a top-down heavy approach from the national government to the states. And in a way, this is sort of a return back to the traditional model, the dual federalism, where it's an effort to reduce the power of the federal government, return power to the states, and also sort of shrink the role that the federal government plays in our lives. So what brings about this shift to new federalism? Well, several things. One, starting in the 1970s, we see a rise of conservatives in the United States, okay? So, from FDR sort of moving forward to the 1970s, we really see more of a dominance of the Democratic Party. Not only in the presidency, you do have some Republican presidents during that time period, but significantly in Congress. That begins to change in the 1970s. And then when Ronald Reagan takes office in the 1980s, we really see the rise of the conservative movement in the United States. And that's something that stayed alive and well, for, really since Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. Today, we're probably in a more of a competitive party system where there are clear differences between the Democrats and the Republicans. But what brings about the shift to new federalism is the rise of the conservatives. You might be saying, well, what do conservatives have to do with federalism? Well, conservatives generally, one, see a more limited role of government in people's lives, okay? And two, that they are much more likely to, at least in theory, want to return power to the states and have a less powerful national government, okay? And so, that with regulated federalism, where the national government had a lot of powers and it was dictating to the states, that really, rubbed up, that kind of, irritated the conservatives. They just didn't like that much federal government or any government involved in our lives, and they certainly didn't want to see the federal government to be that large. There's also a general backlash to federal preemptions and unfunded mandates. A lot of the regulatory laws from the 1960s and 70s told states what they needed to do, but they didn't necessarily give them the funds that they needed to do those things. So an unfunded mandate is where you place a mandate, you say you must do this, states, but you don't give them enough funding in order to achieve those goals. Now, when you read more about unfunded mandates, it's a little bit more complicated than that, because there was kind of a divestment in giving monies to the states by some of the more conservative presidents like Ronald Reagan, in a way because they wanted to, shrink the role of the federal government. And one way to do that is to get states angry at the federal government for not giving them enough funding. But also in the 1970s, it was a time of economic hardship as well. And so, the funding, was also a little problematic as well. But there was a backlash to the sense of federal government telling states what they should do and not giving states the money that they need. There's a return to this is coupled with the return to the states' rights movement, the 10th Amendment. When I was in graduate school and I was a teaching assistant for a constitutional law professor, and there was one of the students in the class. He was an undergraduate. It wasn't a graduate level class. I was the teaching assistant for it. And every time that they would bring up a case having to do with states' rights or about the balance between the power of the national government and the states, there was a student who sat in the front row, and he'd bring out his Constitution and he would go, the 10th Amendment, right? He was a real states rightist. Well, that was, a popular point of view in the 1980s and the 1990s, this returning the power to the states. And that the Supreme Court, remember the Supreme Court in the 1937 began to change its interpretation on the Commerce Clause, making it easier for the national government to regulate commerce within a state, not just between states. Well, the Supreme Court, starting in the 1980s, begins to get more conservative. And with more conservative justices, you have more justices who are willing to rule against Congress, saying that Congress exceeded their constitutional authority. So how was new federalism achieved? Well, it was achieved through a theory or a concept known as devolution, okay? And devolution, it was the idea that you transfer responsibility from the federal government to state and local governments, okay? So it doesn't mean that you're not going to have federal goals, but you're going to give states a lot more leeway in terms of implementing those goals, right? And so, think about regulated federalism. It was this idea that we're going to give states the money, but we don't really trust them to do right by the money that we give them, right? That we need to have more of a mandate and oversight of that, right? This is a move away from that. It's sort of saying, we trust states to do the right thing, right? And if they want to use that money in order to, achieve a broad national goal, they can kind of figure out what works best in their state. And so devolution is achieved by moving away from grants and aid to these things called block grants. And so grants and aid were sort of like, here's the money and this is what you must do with it, right? And if you don't do it, then the federal government is going to come in and say, no, you need to use this federal monies according to the reason why it was given to you. Block grants are a little bit more, sort of like they're less, they constrain the states less. And so this is giving federal money to states and localities, and that they could, they might get a grant to alleviate poverty, but then states can come up with sort of innovative ways of how they're going to use that money to alleviate poverty. And so it gives states more leeway to use federal dollars to craft policies that achieve a broad national goal, but do it in a way that they see best fits for their state. At some point, there was also general revenue sharing. They'll read about that in the textbook. We don't have that anymore. This was an idea under the Nixon administration that was basically like we would raise federal taxes and we would give federal taxes, a portion of that directly to the states, and they could use those federal taxes as however they saw fit. But that was a way of devolving, resources to the states to address issues. But given financial constraints and concerns regarding financial spending, we don't have general revenue sharing at the national level anymore. We do at the state level, but not at the national level. And then also was achieved by just generally reducing federal spending, right? If you take away federal spending, then it's much more difficult to institute federal regulations on states. And there are upsides to that and downsides of that, which you'll read about in more detail in the textbook. You might be wondering, Professor Hankinson, what the F is this? Well, teaching about devolution reminds me of my brother's favorite band growing up in the 1980s was Devo. And for some of you retro folks out there, you might like Devo, but when I was creating this PowerPoint, I was like, I must put up a picture of We Are Not Men, We Are Devo, the album. So on your midterm exam, it's still a ways off, but that it just a heads up, there will be a question about federalism on the midterm exam. And so in preparation for that, and after reading the chapter, you might want to think critically about federalism. Like, which do you think is the proper balance between the national and state governments? Do you like to have a stronger national government that gives less leeway to the states, or do you think that states should be trusted and given more leeway to make decisions for how they want to achieve these broad national goals? Is the shift in the power sharing relationship a sign of a healthy democracy? So federalism is part and parcel of the architecture of democracy, right? It's a way of, having a sort of a tug of war between the states and the national governments. So when you see this shifting back and forth, is that sign of a healthy democracy that, as how we consider democracy and the proper relationship between the federal and the state governments, that there should be some, maneuvering in terms of adjusting that relationship over time? Or is one of the models the best models and it should be stuck with? It's the best for democracy, like not just in theory, but in practice. And it's the era or the model that should be stuck with. And so new federalism attempts to rein in federal powers. Has it gone far enough? Has it gone too far? Is it, hamstringing the federal government's ability to do its job? And if you write the paper on federalism, you will dig in more deeply on this for your citizenship and action paper. If you watch that documentary that really deals with this, what the proper balance is between the federal and state governments. All right. Thanks for making it through the lectures on federalism. Thanks for your time and attention, and I'll talk to you again soon.